I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. We will be taking you through an introduction to setting and science-based targets with a very specific sector focus. So my name is Hannah Doughty. I am the account manager for GSMA and their work with CDP's supply chain program. But I'm just here in a hosting capacity today, and for any questions that you have throughout. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to our lovely speakers, who I am honoured to introduce to you. First up, we have Stephen Moore. He is Head of Climate Action at the GSMA, and a lot of you will know Stephen, will have come across him and the work he's been doing to champion leadership in the decarbonising sector. He will be giving you some background, some context, the sector-specific picture, and setting us up to have a closer look at science-based targets. So for that, we have a couple of people on the line. We have Lea Fink, who is the European lead for the Commit to Action arm of CDP. Now, she is a kind of our direct line into the SBTI, and she's involved in a whole range of initiatives, promoting them and understanding the logic behind them. This includes business ambition for 1.5 and RE100, as well as SBTs. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Veronika Thieme. She is a consultant from the Carbon Trust, and she is very kindly stepping in for Andy Stevens, Associate Director of the Carbon Trust, who is unable to join us today at such short notice. Veronika is very, very much immersed in the work on the ICT sector pathway and the guidance that GSMA has been working on with Carbon Trust. So she is your expert guide for the majority of today's presentation. And without further ado, I will hand over to Stephen to give you that sector-specific context and get us started. Stephen, let me know when you want me to flick through the slides.
Great, thanks very much, Hannah. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, as it may be for many of you. So I just wanted to open and talk about the mobile industry commitment that we have made to climate action. So last year, in February 2019, the GSMA board committed to take climate action by declaring that they were going to work with the industry to figure out the path to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and then work to support the industry with setting climate targets that are in line with that. So the process for achieving that was set out to be the following. Firstly, it was to better understand what GSMA members, mobile operators, yourselves, what your climate risks and opportunities are, so undergoing disclosure through CDP. Secondly, it was figuring out what the mobile industry pathway to zero emissions would be. And then thirdly, it was around supporting members in setting emissions targets that were aligned to that pathway. And if we just move on to the next slide. So what's been the progress so far against those three areas? First of all, in terms of members' climate disclosure, more than 50 mobile operator groups disclosed their climate risk to CDP last year, which was absolutely fantastic. And that covered more than 2/3 of mobile connections globally. On the second area around the net zero pathway, this was calculated with through a consortium of the ITU, the GSMA, GESI, and the Science Based Targets Initiative. And the net zero pathway was both calculated and agreed, and it is applicable for mobile operators, fixed line operators, and data center operators as well. And in terms of the third area around target setting, already we have 29 operators representing almost 1/3 of global connections that have committed to or have set science-based carbon reduction targets. And those operators have combined revenues of more than $600 billion. So it's a huge shift on behalf of the industry to align behind science-based carbon reduction targets. So if we move on to the next slide, what's next? So as I mentioned, many operators have already committed to or set science-based carbon reduction targets, and you can see the list of them and those operators on the slide here. But the next step is actually to understand how they can potentially align, or yourselves can potentially align your science-based targets to the new net zero pathway. And this is why we're holding this webinar, to explain how to do that, and also to give a bit of a background around the Science-Based Targets Initiative and why we are doing this in the first place. So on this particular point, I'll hand over to Lea, and she's going to talk about the SBTI.
Thank you, Stephen, and I am happy to give you a short introduction now to the Science-Based Targets Initiative overall and what we're doing and why we're doing this. So the initiative is a collaborative initiative by CDP, UN Global Compact, WWF, and the World Resource Institute, which was founded in 2015, really with the objective of enabling companies to do just what Stephen said, essentially. So to have a clear pathway to be on track to limit massive global warming and to do, well, the fair share to reach the Paris Agreement's objectives, essentially. And over the last 5 years, we've seen a rapid uptake of companies joining the Science-Based Targets initiatives across geographies and across sectors. We now have almost 900 companies that have formally joined the Science-Based Targets initiative, and out of these, we have 365 companies that have gotten their targets officially validated and approved by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So what are science-based targets? I'm assuming that most of you are already aware. They are greenhouse gas emission reduction targets that are aligned with what climate science is telling us is necessary in order to reach the Paris Agreement, or long version, in order to keep global temperature increase within 1.5 and 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial temperature levels. So what we do have on one side, we have a long-term goal, which is decarbonizing the global economy until 2050, ideally earlier, so to reach net zero emissions in the second half of the century. And science-based targets are, can be seen as a tool in the sense that they provide your company with a very clear pathway on how quickly and how much to reduce to make sure that you're actually effectively working into this direction and that you are on track. So they short to medium time frame targets, and what is illustrated here by this little step graph, so to say. So they are quality assurance that also on the short to medium time frame help you to guide decision making to move into the right direction. And as also Stephen also said, disclosure, so annually reporting on your emissions, but as well on how this transition to a zero carbon economy is affecting the business in terms of risks and opportunities, and publicly disclosing this information to your stakeholders, and very important as well to shareholders, is a very crucial element of this journey here to effectively communicate that your company is on track to meet this long-term goal on the horizon. And the process to join the Science-Based Targets Initiative usually starts with a public commitment, which is a letter that a company signs stating that it will develop science-based targets aligned with our criteria and methods within 24 months. This step is not obligatory, but we do encourage companies to take that step in order to as well communicate to the world that this is what you're doing and that you're committed to figure out for your company what that means to do your share and to develop your own science-based targets. In that development process, this is really where a lot of this guidance and tools and support comes in, where GSMA has done a great job together with this consortium to develop also this sector-specific guidance that you have at your hands, and that should very much help you to navigate through this process and develop high-quality targets. And once that's done, you submit your targets to the initiative for an official validation, where we then, in a peer-reviewed process, check whether these targets are aligned with our criteria, and then if they are, you receive an approval letter, and the targets are publicly announced on our website. So you can also go on the website and, for instance, filter for your particular sector and see all already publicly approved targets and which temperature level they are aligned with. And these are the main elements of a science-based target, which is, of course, or let's say the science-based targets journey generally is defined by, of course, the sector and a lot of company-specific information, but there is a lot of common ground, let's say, and it always starts with that question of the global carbon budget. So how much can the world still emit, which is defining the climate scenario that we're choosing to model a target, essentially. That you can see in the left bucket on the slide. And the next step is then to assess, what does that mean for my company? What does that mean for a sector? So this is essentially what has been done already with the ICT guidance that we're going to hear more about today. This is an allocation approach, so to allocate the global carbon budget across companies, essentially. In general, the Science-Based Targets Initiative is for Scope 1 and 2 targets, accepting two methods, the absolute contraction method, or also absolute-based approach, as we call it, and then, which is applicable to all sectors, and then we have the sector-based approach, like the one for ICT companies that we are speaking about today, and which is also often called the sectoral decarbonization approach. And generally, we do encourage companies to always use the sector-based approach if available, as it is the most robust and specific pathway for your company, consequently. And the third bucket here is your company's profile. So how does your footprint look like? How are your growth projections? And where are your emissions hotspots and data, or the maturity in terms of data collection, etc., such as reflecting as well, again, this journey aspect of the science-based targets development approach. And all these aspects will define how the science-based targets will look like for your individual company. And now I want to quickly run you through the general Science-Based Targets Initiative criteria. And I'm going to make this quite short. This is also not a extensive list, but we do have all of these resources online as well, and they are integrated into the ICT guidance. But just to give you a general overview. The level of ambition is, of course, an important element. We increased the level of ambition last year when, let's say, the climate science told us that 2 degrees is no longer an option. So we increased the minimum level of ambition to way below 2 degrees, but we do very much encourage every company to set 1.5 degree aligned targets, as the special report on 1.5 degrees by the IPCC tells us very clearly that this is what is necessary. Science-based targets need to be forward-looking, so that essentially just means that you cannot have already reached your target when you submit them to the initiative. So the ambition criteria needs to be aligned over the full target time frame. Scope 1 and 2 targets need to cover at least 95% of your overall Scope 1 and 2 emissions. The time frame that we generally accept are 5 to 15 years into the future, and we ask companies to annually disclose the greenhouse gas emissions inventory and progress on the science-based targets on an annual basis through CDP, ideally, but that is also possible theoretically in another place, such as an annual report or sustainability report. And for Scope 3, we're also going to hear more about from Veronika in a few minutes. I generally ask companies to set a Scope 3 target if Scope 3 emissions are significant, and we define that significance threshold with Scope 3 making up for more than 40% of the total Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And here it's just important to know that we do provide a lot more flexibility for Scope 3 targets than for Scope 1 and 2 targets, both in terms of the level of ambition as well as in terms of the boundary of the target. And lastly, I want to shortly tell you about a campaign that we launched last June, which is called the Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees. Again, just fostering that messaging that this is the level of ambition that we need to see now. This is the leadership level. And with this campaign, we want to enable companies to commit, to make a clear commitment to align with the 1.5 degree future. And I won't go into much detail on the different options that companies have to do that today. But if you do have any questions, let us know, and we can provide you with all the necessary details. We do have now more than 200 companies that have joined the campaign, which is fantastic. And one important element of the of joining the campaign as well is that companies are committing to engage in positive climate advocacy efforts. So this is really a United Nations backed also advocacy campaign to really catalyze that private sector voice in order to also inspire other companies to align with 1.5, and of course to motivate policymakers to increase the level of ambition. And you can also see on that slide here that we have a lot of telecommunications companies that have joined the campaign, which is fantastic. So that is it from me on science-based targets, and I'm happy to hand over to Veronika. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks, Lea. And hi, everyone. It's Veronika Thieme. I work as a consultant for the Carbon Trust, and as Hannah mentioned earlier, my main area of focus is working with the ICT sector. So I'm going to start by giving you just a very brief introduction to the Carbon Trust, before then going into how companies in the ICT sector can set science-based targets in line with the recent guidance. For those of you who haven't heard of the Carbon Trust is a not-for-profit, mission-driven organization with the mission to accelerate the move to a sustainable low-carbon economy. So we work with businesses, governments, and public sector bodies to help them measure and reduce their carbon emissions and move towards a low-carbon economy. We were set up around 20 years ago, and now we have a sort of worldwide team of experts across many different fields, including, amongst others, around carbon management, carbon strategy, and also in setting science-based targets. And to date, we've worked with over 85 companies to help them set science-based targets. So we just heard Lea talking a little bit about the general requirements for setting science-based targets in line with the SBTi criteria. But there are also a number of sector-specific requirements for certain industries that have been developed or are currently being developed, for example, for more carbon-intensive sectors like transport, for example. And a lot of these sector-specific approaches use the scenarios and forecasts from the International Energy Agency, so the IEA, for their energy and carbon emissions in that sector. However, for the ICT sector, because it is relatively small in terms of emissions compared to those other sectors, it isn't split out as a separate sector within the IEA data. So for that reason, the GSMA, together with the ITU and GESI, and also with the technical support from the Carbon Trust, decided to collaborate on putting together a sector-specific approach for setting science-based targets for the ICT sector. So this specific approach for setting science-based targets was summarized in a guidance document, which was reviewed and approved by the SBTI earlier this year, and then published in February. So this guidance document is available on all three of these organizations' websites, and there's also a more practical sort of step-by-step guide that was published by the GSMA. I'm now going to give you a quick overview of this ICT sector approach for setting science-based targets, but do be aware that these guidance documents are freely available should you want to dig a little bit deeper into this approach, or just review some of the things we will discuss today. So the ICT sector approach was based on an ICT sector decarbonization pathway, and this was published by the ITU as part of the recommendation LTU 1470. And this pathway that was developed is in line with the Paris Agreement, and it is also in line with the, and essentially in line with the 1.5 degree global decarbonization trajectory. The other important thing to note is that the pathway that was developed focuses only on the decarbonization pathway for Scope 1 and 2 emissions of the ICT sector, so the emissions associated with ICT companies' own operations. And while there is some general guidance around setting Scope 3 targets in the guidance document, this is sort of based on the general guidance for setting Scope 3 targets from the SBTI and not the ICT sector specific pathway. So the overall ICT sector pathway that was developed was then sort of split into different subsectors, which are mobile telecoms, fixed telecoms, data centers, and ICT equipment manufacturers. And the reasons for splitting them out is that each of these subsectors have their sort of unique challenges when it comes to decarbonizing their activities, and therefore also require their own sort of decarbonization pathway. One important thing to note is that while the subsector pathway for ICT equipment manufacturers was included in the work done by the ITU, there is ongoing work to include this into the SBTI approved sector approach for ICT companies, and the aim is to have this added into the approach later this year. So on this slide, you can now see what these individual subsector pathways look like from a baseline of 2015 going out all the way to 2030. And you can see the overall pathway in green at the top, followed by the individual subsector pathways. As mentioned before, the overall sector pathway as well as the individual subsector pathways are all aligned with a 1.5 degree trajectory. And they were also compared to and checked against other 1.5 degree scenarios like the IPCC 1.5 degree scenario, the 1.5 degree absolute contraction scenario developed by the SBTI, as well as against some of the pathways from the IEA energy technology perspective scenarios. And so the way these pathways were derived is, first of all, by developing a sort of robust bottom-up baseline for 2015, which sort of had to work out what the exact energy consumption was of the sector and subsectors, and then also the associated carbon emissions. This was then combined with energy projections for the ICT sector out to 2030, which were based on the technological improvements and sort of changes that are predicted to have an impact on the sector's energy consumption, like, for example, the rollout of 5G, as well as potential energy efficiency improvements through, for example, improvements in computing power, and also changes in the types of devices being used over time. And these energy projections were then converted into carbon trajectories by applying emission factors that are based on an electricity grid decarbonization pathway, also aligned with 1.5 degrees. So once these pathways were derived, the next step was then to use these pathways to develop an approach that companies could follow to set their own reduction pathways aligned with 1.5 degrees. And so on this slide, you can see the three pathways for operator emissions, so for mobile, fixed, and data center emissions, and also what scope 1 and 2 reductions need to be achieved for individual companies over a 10-year period, so between 2020 and 2030. So for mobile operators, they're required to reduce by 45%, fixed network operators by 62%, and 53% for data center operators. So one thing you might have noticed is that the pathway only goes out to 2030, whereas the generic guidance that Lea mentioned earlier for SBTs allows for a 5 to 15-year time frame for science-based targets. So this difference to the general SBTI criteria was introduced due to the fast-changing nature of the sector, and therefore targets using this approach should not be set further ahead than 2030. So these are basically the general reductions that are required for companies in different subsectors. And now we'll just go into a little bit more detail about how you would calculate a company-specific target. So maybe taking a step back for one moment to just determine the sort of overall actions that would be required to set a science-based target. The first step is, of course, to measure your scope 1 and 2 baseline. So here it's important to obviously follow the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Accounting Standard, and also to consider the sort of two different approaches for calculating your scope 2 emissions. So calculating both a market and a location-based scope 2 footprint. And then the next step will be to calculate your scope 1 and 2 target, which we'll go into more detail in a minute by using the ICT sector approach for science-based targets, and also making use of the GSMA guide, which includes sort of a practical step-by-step approach. And then once you've set a scope 1 and 2 target, you then want to shift your focus to scope 3, and of course start first of all by measuring your complete scope 3 impact to develop your baseline, which can then be used to set your scope 3 target using the general SBTI criteria for setting scope 3 targets. And then the final step, once you've confirmed your targets internally, is to get them approved by the SBTI through their validation process. So next, I'm going to focus in a little bit more on steps 2 and 4, so the sort of target setting processes. But if you require any further information on any of the other steps, there is some additional guidance around this in the GSMA guide. And of course, we can also discuss them during the Q&A at the end. So what are the steps that would be involved with setting a Scope 1 and 2 target for your operations? So first you want to define what your basically target boundary should look like, so what is included within your target. Then you want to define your baseline and your target year. And then as a next step, you would then want to allocate your Scope 1 and 2 emissions to the individual subsectors that we just saw. So some companies might just have activities in one area, like data center operators, but a lot of companies will have operations that go across these different subsectors. And for them, it can often be quite a tricky thing to split their emissions into these subsectors, particularly if they don't already report their emissions or their energy in this way. So once that's been done, the next step is then to calculate the reductions required for the individual operations in each subsector by applying subsector reduction percentages. And these percentages can all be found in a table in the guidance documents for each subsector and for each baseline and target year. And then once you've done that at each subsector level, you would then add up the absolute reductions required across each subsector for your company to get your overall company SBT. So to give a more practical example of this, we've just given here an example of a company that has both fixed and mobile operations. They've decided on a baseline year of 2019 and a target year of 2025. And the emissions from their mobile operations are 250,000 tons of CO2e, and their fixed network emissions are 150,000 tons of CO2e. And so to make things easier, they've decided to combine all of their network-related emissions with their sort of non-network emissions, like emissions from offices and fleet. So the emission reduction factor for mobile operators between 2019 and 2025 is, as you can see here, 0.794 and 0.652 for the fixed operations. So then if you multiply these by the respective emissions for each subsector and then add them together, you can work out that in 2025, this company here needs to have Scope 1 and 2 emissions equating to around 296,000 tons of CO2e or lower to meet its target, which equals roughly a 26% reduction within that time period. So just before we move on to Scope 3, just a few considerations around setting Scope 1 and 2 targets for the ICT sector that you should be aware of. So first of all, it's important to note that currently geographical differences are not taken into account with this approach. This is also the same for other sectoral approaches. But that is not to say that it's not recognized that there are significant differences between regions and countries, particularly when it comes to things like availability of renewables and the electricity grid factors. So there is a potential to incorporate these differences into the ICT sector approach in the future, but these additions would then also need to sort of follow any generic development of methodology by the SBTi. Another thing to note is that the ICT sector approach takes an absolute approach, and this is the case for two reasons. So first, there is not one intensity metric that could be defined which would sort of adequately capture the production output of the ICT sector. And then the second reason is that the standard SDA approach, on which this approach is sort of based, requires convergence of all companies' intensities by 2050. And as the approach requires zero emissions by 2050, so mathematically it would then be the same as sort of following an absolute approach. However, while the overall approach requires absolute reductions, companies are still able to express their targets using an intensity metric that is relevant to their business, as long as the absolute reductions still align. And then the final point here, which was already touched on in the example, is that many companies in the ICT sector will have sort of non-network or non-ICT related emissions. And while they're often small, they still need to be addressed by your targets. So the recommendation here is to account for these activities by combining all of your Scope 1 and 2 emissions and deriving a single science-based target using the ICT sector method, which is then consistent with the overall 1.5 degree trajectory. So that was an overview of setting Scope 1 and 2 targets. Now moving on to Scope 3. So for Scope 3, there's no ICT specific guidance. So companies are required to just follow the general SBTi guidance. And this states that if your Scope 3 emissions account for more than 40% of your total Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, you're required to essentially set a Scope 3 target. Now, from our experience, most MNOs will have Scope 3 footprints that are significantly larger than their Scope 1 and 2, and will therefore be required to set a Scope 3 target. The next criteria around Scope 3 is then that your Scope 3 target, at a minimum, needs to cover 2/3 of your overall Scope 3 emissions. So it doesn't necessarily have to cover all 15 Scope 3 categories. It could only cover a few as long as they make up at least 2/3 of your total Scope 3 footprint. Now, again, from sort of experience, the two categories that will most likely need to be included for an MNO to meet that threshold are the emissions from your purchased goods and services, so Category 1, as well as the emissions from the use of your sold products, so Category 11. Once you've then defined what should be included in your target boundary, the next step would then be to select your base year, your target year, and then to calculate your target. Now, for Scope 3, there are a few different options for setting a target. The first and simplest approach is to set an absolute target that is in line with a below 2 degree trajectory. The next approach is to set an economic intensity target, which requires a 7% yearly reduction in emissions per value added, or a physical intensity reduction that requires a 2% yearly reduction in emissions per the chosen physical intensity metric, as well as no increases in absolute emissions. And then the final approach is to set a more qualitative supplier or customer engagement target, under which you would need to have enough suppliers to make up 2/3 of your Scope 3 emissions, set a science-based target within the next 5 years, while the time frame for the other three approaches is still a 5 to 15-year time frame. So these are the sort of 4 main approaches, but you can also choose to set a target that combines these approaches. Again, the most likely Scope 3 targets that we would see MNOs setting is either an absolute target for both categories 1 and 11, or a combination of an absolute target or a supplier engagement target for category 1, together with an absolute or customer engagement target for category 11. So one thing to be aware of when setting an engagement target that would include SMEs having to set science-based targets is the new route for SMEs that has just come out by the SBTi, and which will come into force from July this year. This simplifies the process for setting SBTs for SMEs by having predefined options for Scope 1 and 2 targets, and also in addition for Scope 3, SMEs are only required to commit to measure and reducing their Scope 3 emissions without a strict requirement to set a quantified target. So it still requires them to consider their entire value chain impact without putting too much of a burden on them. So we talked a lot about setting targets just now, but another important topic is, of course, how these targets will be achieved, as the 1.5 degree trajectory is definitely a challenging one, which will require sort of significant changes across all operations. So we've just picked out a few things that we think will be crucial for this. Of course, it will be important to continue implementing energy efficiency initiatives across networks, especially with sort of new technologies like 5G coming in. But energy efficiency improvements are also required across other operations like your fleet and offices. And then, of course, a continuous sort of improvement or a continuous move to renewables is also crucial, whether that's by purchasing renewable electricity certificates or by investing in on-site renewables like solar. And this is, of course, also important when you're looking at decarbonizing part of your Scope 1 by replacing fossil fuels with sort of on-site solar technologies. But it will also require looking beyond your own operations and sort of engaging the end consumer, making them more aware of their purchases, but also educating them on how they can reduce the in-use emissions. And then finally, it's also about engaging your supply chain. So whether you set an engagement target or not, you will need to engage your suppliers to reduce their emissions. And I think one of the main ways of achieving this will be through, for example, industry engagements and also working with other companies in your sector. So one of the key things that I just mentioned was the importance of renewable electricity sources and the decarbonization of the grid. So the graph on this slide shows the overall ICT footprint, both without factoring in a decarbonization of the electricity emission factor compared to the ICT 1.5 degree trajectory that factors in grid decarbonization. And so as you can see, the grid decarbonization is really key to being in line with the 1.5 degree trajectory. And while as a sort of large electricity purchaser, you will benefit from the grid decarbonization, it is also important that you take action to create the demand that will allow the grid to decarbonize. And so at this point, I will hand back over to Lea to talk a little bit more about how companies can take action in this space.
Yes, thank you, Veronika. Yeah, we wanted to tell you about another very relevant initiative which fits nicely into what Veronika just explained, the crucial role that renewable electricity plays for the sector as a main transition tool. So the RE100 initiative is a collaborative effort of the Climate Group and CDP, uniting leading companies globally that are committed to source 100% renewable electricity across their operations, and we now have 232 member companies globally. Well, businesses clearly play a very important role in terms of transitioning the global electricity market. So RE100's objective is really to bundle that global corporate demand and as well work with it to help enabling or help to create a more enabling policy environment and help to mature markets in geographies where renewable electricity markets might be less developed still today. And then on the other hand, it is of course a great tool for companies to set a robust renewable electricity goal, which is a very clear messaging to stakeholders, but also, for instance, to your suppliers. So companies join the initiative by setting a target to reach this 100%. prior to 2050, even though we see that the majority of companies joining RE100 set a target year between 2025 and 2030. Companies need to annually demonstrate progress and also annually reporting on their renewable electricity sourcing practices. And yeah, again, if you do want to learn more, please don't hesitate to get in touch with CDP to explore how an RE100 membership might look like for your company in more detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. Yes, I had one question come in actually. Lea might be best placed to answer this one. Is what if you're not sure how to get to your science-based reduction target to align to the new ICT sector pathway? Your company is not sure how you're going to do it. Would you advise still to committing and setting a target, or what would you advise in that situation? I think quite a number of our members are in that situation.
Do you think that question is meant as in not being sure how the target will look like in the end, because maybe the data collection has not been finalized, for instance?
Yes, I think that's part of it. And then also maybe not seeing the route to achieving the target. So exactly everything that will be able to be done, there's still being work around that. What would you advise? Because I know that some of the operators are in that situation where there is still some work to do around figuring out what the target will be and then also how they will reach it.
Yeah, I think that these are two different things, and a target has a very important role to play in terms of strategic thinking and as well for internal conversations within a company and decision making. So what we do encourage companies, I mean, of course, the Science Based Targets Initiative and everything we're talking about today are voluntary actions that we do know are necessary, and of course we have more and more stakeholders increasingly scrutinizing corporates to set science-based targets, especially from the investor side. But generally, of course, this is a voluntary leadership effort. And the reason why we have this public commitment step, for instance, is to communicate to the public that you know that this is necessary, but you might actually not know how to get there. This is very normal. And we have companies that are sometimes very transparent about that uncertainty. And we think that is actually really great. And to say we are embarking on that journey, we are looking into what that means for us. We're taking the necessary steps. And this might mean different things for every company. So this might mean still having to calculate scope 3 footprint or even scope 1 and 2 footprint, and then calculating the targets, and then probably doing a scenario analysis and getting them approved. And so first part of the question, I think it is absolutely recommended to be confident and with this uncertainty to some extent, to start that journey and to make that commitment. And on the other hand, to use the support that is out there. So I think you heard today that as well across different institutions and organizations, we're here to support you along the way as well. We're providing and also what GSMA is doing, bringing companies together to overcome barriers and to learn from others that might be further along that journey.
That's great. Thanks very much, Lea. I've had another question come in, which is around how science-based targets relate to TCFD. So TCFD being the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So this is the framework that companies are using to understand climate risks and opportunities. I don't know whether Lea, that might be one you can answer, or Veronika, who would like to have a go at explaining how the SBT links to TCFD.
I can give it a go, but I think it would also be great to quickly hear from Hannah from a CDP perspective, because TCFD is reporting. I mean, it's of course a reporting framework, and CDP has worked to integrate the TCFD recommendations into the CDP questionnaires. That then the Science Based Targets Initiative, of course, is encouraging to comply with in terms of a reporting format, so to say. And targets are an essential aspect of the TCFD recommendations, and science-based targets are globally recognized as the best practice in emissions reduction target setting.
Certainly, I have to jump in. I think you may have partially answered the question already, but of course, CDP's reporting platform is aligned with TCFD, and what we're trying to do is give you a framework to work with that, with a high level of transparency within a high degree of uncertainty, because as Lea said earlier, you might not know how you are getting there, but you do have to report the progress you are making as truthfully as possible. So our questions are structured to set you up to succeed in that. Another thing I will say is that you should definitely check out the CDSB TCFD Knowledge Hub and look at their advice on how to report targets with quite a lot of detail and transparency according to TCFD guidelines, because that will be a very, very handy set of resources for you, as well as the CDP platform enabling you to put the information in an easy to digest manner. Does that help? I hope so.
Yes, that's very
Grand.
Thank you, Hannah.
I do have a number of other questions that have come in. Do you mind if I run through those quickly?
Yes, go ahead.
Certainly. So we have had a question through just asking us to recap how a company should validate their target. And then we also... Oh, go ahead.
So the validation process of the Science Based Targets Initiative. Yeah, I try to make that very short. It includes several steps, but from a company side, it is essentially one important step, which is to fill in a submission form, which is a document where you submit your most recent greenhouse gas inventory, your targets, just the target wording, and some other important company information. And then with that, you enter into the target validation service. And within 30 business days, you should be receiving a written feedback, seeing how your targets are aligned with our criteria or where potential adjustments are still needed. And if you want to see the steps in detail of the validation process, and please refer to the target validation protocol, is called, on our website, where you can find all steps and everything you need to know.
Great, and very, very quickly, before everyone has to drop off, a final question on Scope 3. So as you mentioned, Category 1 and 11 in Scope 3 are major emission sources. And in reality, we are not able to calculate all of Scope 3 emissions. In this situation, can we submit an SBT after evaluating only some of the categories in Scope 3 emission sources?
Can I answer that?
Go ahead.
We do ask companies to conduct a full screening across all 15 categories, but that can be a high-level screening. We also have an online tool available to do that. So again, similar to what I said before, we do encourage companies to start the journey. So setting a Scope 3 target based on high-level estimates is acceptable from our perspective. And we then encourage, so essentially set a target despite that uncertainty. And as Veronika said, Scope 3 targets cover 2/3 of Scope 3 emissions. So we want companies to focus on the hotspots in their Scope 3 and start tackling those, knowing that it might be necessary to come back to other categories and take a closer look at them at a later stage. And that is acceptable. And then improve data quality over time. But we do need a full screening in terms of a high-level high-level calculation to start off with for every category.
Perfect. Thank you once again to all of our speakers, to all the attendees who give up their time to come and listen today.